in some way, shape, or form. So the sort of step we took here when we sort of did what Julie said, which was take a step back and look at the two counties together, rather than the municipal level work that Rusty and I have been doing in quite a number of communities at quite a level of depth that is beyond what we did here today. What we have is an approach that looked at communities based on their historic development patterns. So first ring and second ring suburbs. So that was the geography we sort of looked at. The city of Buffalo as the core region. Much of these communities fall within the urbanized area, which shows on this map in the red line. It generally accounts for about 84% of all households in the region. So it captures a lot of households that exist in the two counties. It accounts for about 94% of all renters and about roughly low 80% of all homeowners. So it's from a geographic perspective, it's a good slice of the overall regional market. There's not a lot of effort made here to address rural and semi-rural communities. The second part about the geography is really the data that we looked at here. In December, the 5-year ACS was released, which gives us the first actual time where we can look at 3 consecutive ACS periods, beginning in 05 to 09, 2010 to 2014, and 2015 to 2019. So the approach we took was to look at these geographies, in particular using the 3 5-year estimates that we can now sort of link together in a non-overlapping fashion to look at this data. So again, a lot of the stuff is purely descriptive and should be familiar to many of us here. Okay, Rusty. And there's Rusty. These all have animation, so the second you can hit the second one. Essentially, this is a familiar story for all of us that live, work, and play in Western New York. Population change is always a constant, and unfortunately for us in this region, it's historically since 1950 been a trend that we've seen go backwards. We're seeing a little bit of stabilization in the population in the region, and when we look a little bit closer, Erie County's seen a little bit of an increase in population. Niagara County, a decrease, and on the whole, an overall decrease across these 3 years, these 3 consecutive 5-year ACS periods. What we really have is a game of musical chairs in this region. Our first ring suburbs in our core central city continue to, in general, lose population, in the outer ring, second ring suburbs continue to gain population, right? A process that we're all relatively familiar with. Okay, Rusty. We're also getting older, and that's we'll come back to that, particularly when we look at households. Households are the building block we're most interested in. But in general, we have fewer people ages 0 to 14 and more people that are aging into the retiree cohort. The median age is going up. Interestingly, the city of Buffalo is one of the few communities where the median age is actually decreased. So the city of Buffalo, Cheektowaga, I believe, Lackawanna, and Niagara Falls were the communities that saw a decrease. And without digging too deep into the data yet, it's probably connected to relatively lower cost housing in those communities, in places where people need lower cost housing. So we are getting older, and we'll come back to this as it relates to households in a second. Rusty, you can go ahead. It is, a region that is becoming more and more diverse as the days pass, but that diversity, as we well know, isn't really leaking out into our suburbs. As we can see from the graph here, the suburban communities, particularly the ones that are growing rapidly, so your Hamburgs and Pendletons and Orchard Parks and Lancasters, tend to grow in a household pattern that looks predominantly white. Much of the diversity in the region is really diversity that's happening in the city, and a lot of that diversity is, in fact, the result of international in-migration, right? And sort of the landing spot of many of those households is in the city first. So we are still a region that's largely a white suburban region in a minority, largely minority, diverse urban core, if you will. Okay, Rusty. So, when we think about housing, and this is the sort of key point here, the population data is critically important as a baseline or a foundational component, but and it's household or population is important for municipalities as it relates to school districts and businesses as it relates to potential customers. But when we think about households in the housing market, those numbers are important, but the actual number of households matters more. And how households change both in terms of absolute numbers and the characteristics of those households really can help us understand how it is that we move forward and think about addressing changes in household characteristics requisite to changes we necessarily need in the into the marketplace. So, despite this long run process of population decline, we're having an increase in households in this region. And if we look at the chart here, those household increases are largely in the same places where we talked about in the prior slide, where we see households, new household formation that looks predominantly white. So our second ring suburbs, including this town of Amherst, which sort of straddles this older first ring suburban component and the newer emerging second ring component in the northeastern part of town. But all told, we're increasing in households in the region, but our older first ring suburbs in the city of Buffalo, city of Niagara Falls are seeing a loss of households in the region. And that becomes tied to issues of vacancy and abandonment, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Okay, Rusty, thanks. The other issue, and I know Rusty will dig into the family question a little bit later, but the types of households we're seeing in this region is also changing. And we're seeing fewer and fewer family households and more non-family households. And so, when we think about what that means for the housing market, those two types of households generally have different needs and different preferences as it relates to shopping in the marketplace for new units. We know that generally family households with kids in schools prefer high quality districts. The question we have in this region is how do they get access to those places, right? And that's part of the question we'll try to get to when we move into the sort of second component of this overall project. Rusty, you can go ahead. So this will come back to be one of our key issues, and I think everybody recognizes that as the population in total, sort of as individuals, we continue to get older. What does that mean for housing in this region? And what we tend to have here, we have this process in over these last 15 years where the age of householders tends to increase. And so what we have is an older household in this region over and over and over again, year after year after year. Rusty, you can go one more. And when we think ahead, and when Rusty and I begin to look in 5 and 10 year increment down the road and project what we might have for households and population, the group that's highlighted here, the 45 to 54 owners and renters, if we think moving ahead 15 years, those become, people that are 60 to 69. And those are two rather large cohorts of households. And that will drastically shift or should drastically shift how those people consume and how those households consume housing units in the region. And we'll talk about household size here in a second as it relates to this question.
Jason?
Yes.
We have a question around how you define a non-family household.
A non-family household is a household that is inhabited by people that are not related by blood or marriage or adoption. I think it's that simple. So a family household is a household that the householder and any other person in the house is either married, related by blood, or related by adoption. So hopefully, Dale, I think that was your question. Hopefully that answers it. Okay, Rusty, I think you can jump to the next slide. So when we think about household size, and this is kind of trying to paint the whole household picture in this region, and also paint the picture of how it is that how and where we produce housing in the two counties. Households continue to get smaller and smaller, both family households and non-family households. So it's an interesting sort of paradox because the household sizes tend to keep getting smaller, and the average house that we continue to build in this region continues to grow, right? So we're down since the 1950s in terms of total people in households by about one person, but we've increased the size of houses built in Erie County over that time period to about by 1,000 square feet, right? So we're building larger and larger houses on larger and larger lots for smaller and smaller households. And we know, and everyone here knows, that when you do that, when you build large houses on large lots, it means that the household income necessary to own and maintain that is very limited to a very small number of households in the region, right? So there's an equity question in the way we produce housing in our region. Rusty, go ahead. Another issue that seems to be emerging, and sometimes things jump out at us when we get into the data and we don't expect to see some things. And I didn't expect to see the number of homeowners actually decreasing. I thought it would just be a smaller rate of growth in new homeownership. But what we have in this region is an actual decline in the number of households that are homeowners, while we've seen a rapid increase in the number of households that are renters. And so, the table here is just a simple table that tries to look at places based on whether or not they gained or lost owners and renters. But again, the communities in red are, by and large, our older first ring suburban communities that have on net lost total households. Again, the issue is varied across most of the region in most of this data, where most of the data is positive for emerging, growing far out suburban communities, and less so for the inner ring suburbs in the city of Buffalo. Rusty, go ahead. Rusty will get into this a little bit deeper in some of the stuff that he has here, but I think it was important to, median household incomes in the region are increasing, and that's a positive thing. We see a lot of stories about, prior to COVID, the resurgence of this region, and in a lot of ways, people like Rusty and I want to turn to the data to see if the data, at least mirrors the narrative. At least in terms of household incomes in both counties and therefore regionally is up, which is a good sign. At the same time, though, households in poverty remains relatively flat, and Rusty will talk about the challenge we face as it relates to poverty and affordability in our region. But it's important to recognize that even on the face of it, that having household income increases doesn't necessarily result in a decrease in the total number of households that are in poverty, at least the rate in that case. Rusty, go ahead. So this gets to the, some of the stuff Rusty will get into a little way more deeper than this. When we think about the positive improvements in median household income, that's great, but we still have a significant issue as it relates predominantly to renters in this region that are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. The percent of households, renting households that pay more than 30% is almost 1 in 2. And so we still have a long ways to go as it relates to affordability in the region. And I won't dig too much further into that. I'll leave some meat on it for Rusty to jump into.
Jason?
Yes.
We did have a question in the chat around whether or not your numbers, and I suspect that this was on the last slide having to do with income, were comparing information over time, raw or adjusted for inflation.
All income variables are adjusted for inflation.
Okay.
So they're in constant 2019 dollars.
And then we had a second question asking why it was important that the inhabitants are not related by blood. Can you just explain the significance for someone who's not familiar with why that distinction is made?
So I think Rusty's got that in his slide. Rusty, do you want to maybe poke at that right now, or do you want to hold it for when you get into the importance of families? I know it's part of your piece here.
Yeah, so I don't really talk about the distinction. I will say that we track it that way just because the Census Bureau tracks it that way. And so they try to think about the composition of the household and who's living in it. So the only distinction that might be useful in thinking about family versus non-family households is that on the aggregate, and this isn't to say that the situation is true for every single household, but on the aggregate, housing economists have noted different trends in those two types of households in terms of the housing services that they're consuming and what they're demanding. So that's the one reason for tracking it. But practically, it's still just people living together in a house. So we report it the way that the data are collected here.
Okay, Rusty, you can go to the next one. So, I think, part of the work that I was interested in here was really looking at what it is that we produce in the marketplace, really describing how the market produces new units, and then how the types of units that we have in the marketplace actually change over time, which is, in some cases, like in the city of Buffalo, 2-unit structures tend to be ones that will be removed from the marketplace through demolition or whatever the case may be. What tends to stand out when we look at what our market actually is, like in terms of how things are constructed and what actually exists in our stock, is it is largely, and this is no secret to anyone here, a market that single-family detached housing dominates, both what we have and also what we build. It's a dominant force in the development and urbanization of our region. The idea of a single-family suburban home, and again, those are largely in suburban communities, and in some cases rural communities as well. You can go to the next one, Rusty. So there's a ton of data here. I'm not asking anyone to look at it. I think the key point I would make about thinking about vacancy, we have 9,000 plus new households in the region over this 15-year time period. And we still have, over 50,000 vacant units, which is down, just a little over 2,000. But the difference between the 9,000 plus new households and the decrease in the total number of vacant units is about 7,000, which essentially means 7,000 households in the region chose not to absorb existing vacant units, but instead to, in theory, not every single household does that, but on net, buy a new unit in the suburbs because that was what was produced in the region. So the potential absorption rate of vacant units in the region is very minimal, and it largely ties into the reality is if those vacant units are not in communities that are amenity rich, that people prefer and provide the things that they need on a day-to-day basis, it's unlikely under current conditions that those units will get absorbed, right? So Rusty, next slide. So, thinking about, Rusty and I think both consider ourselves geographers above all. And, thinking geographically is kind of the first step for us in most of these projects. I wanted to sort of take a quick look at, using building permit data from the Census Bureau where things were built first, and then looking at real property records from the county second, to understand where new units are being constructed, and just sort of in a simplistic manner, just try to understand whether those new units are being constructed near existing public transportation routes, right? So essentially all we're looking at here really is the geography of where our new units are produced. And it's about, I think it's about 16 or 17% of all new units are not located within walking distance of an existing NFTA bus route. I'm not trying to draw any conclusions to that. It's just sort of a good descriptive endpoint to think about how it is that we produce housing, because the question we really have moving forward is how are we going to produce and reproduce housing given the needs and gaps that Rusty and I managed to identify in this process, right? So I think my last slide's coming up here, Rusty. So there's, just looking at descriptive data without sort of digging in and trying to match, households to units in the marketplace, and really think about putting a hard and fast set of demands that the market has on this descriptive data right now, and sort of holding off for that moving towards the end of March. What we have in the region really, I think, are a couple of key trends. Just looking at this data, one is what I mentioned before, that aging households will be an issue for the region moving forward in the next 10 to 15 years. That'll be predominantly in suburban communities, right? So some of the median household age and the percentage of households over 60 in the suburbs is in many cases 30%. So it's going to be a suburban challenge, if nothing more. The point I made earlier about this sort of spatial mismatch of how we produce housing versus who has housing needs. Our housing production system is dominated by suburban units and auto-dependent communities, so it limits access to people that might want to live in those amenity-rich, high-quality school district communities. I think there's one more here, Rusty, and it's the cost burden. You have an earlier version of mine. I didn't get the updated one that I have on my desk. The last one is that the cost burden question, in particular as it relates to renters, doesn't seem to be one that's it's going away, and I think that ties to other work that's been done in the region on this severe challenge we have with low and moderate income households being a very large portion of our overall household composition, and the real challenge it is for them, regardless of changes in the marketplace, of them actually having enough income to not be cost burden, if you will. So yeah, that's the sort of quick and dirty descriptive information that I have, and I'll let Rusty go from here.
All right. So just to tie in with Jason's last point there, I'll be talking a little bit more about affordability and cost burden. There is a pretty standard definition of cost burden as it relates to federal government data sets that HUD pushes, as well as others. But this is the situation that exists when a household spends more than 30% of its gross monthly income on housing. Now, I will say, for those of you who are in Erie County, Jason and I just completed a deep dive of cost burden in Erie County, incorporating transportation costs, looking at the degree of cost burden. So rather than just, from this sort of binary threshold of 30% or more or not. And so for folks who might be interested in that for just one half of the study area that we're looking at, feel free to reach out to us and I'd be happy to share that document. That paints an even bleaker picture than the one that Jason just presented. In that case, for low-income renters, for example, incorporating transportation costs, we find that something like 7 out of every 10 renters or more in Erie County are actually location cost burdened in terms of what they pay for housing and then transportation they need to get to and from work. For the bulk and the remainder of this presentation, though, we'll be focusing in on just this standard definition, this sort of run-of-the-mill definition of cost burden, looking at 30% or more of household income being spent on housing. And we're doing that for a specific reason, because buckle up, I'm going to ask you to all participate in a thought experiment with me that's going to have us stretch the way that we think about data and look at data in a different way. So that's what's coming up. But before we get there, I do want to sharpen this definition a little bit, because there is often a question when analysts do this cost burden work of what income is available for housing. And it's a question because even in the federal government, agencies define housing cost burden a little bit differently. A lot of the census analysts who will go in and blog on the ACS blog or anything like that will use household income as income available for housing. And so this is just the total money income of all household members who are 15 or over. Versus family income, which is the total income from the head of household, plus anybody who, like Jason was talking about, is related to the head of household by blood or adoption. Now, the distinction here is an important one because in a lot of the Department of Housing and Urban Development and a lot of HUD's policy programs, family income is actually what's used to determine eligibility for programs and eligibility for funding. Now, in a lot of the day-to-day analyses, you'll see that cost burden is specified with household income, but because HUD has this focus on family income, and because other nonprofit agencies like Equitable Growth say that family income tends to be a better measure of standard of living, for among other things, if you're living with a roommate, you might not pool all of your income with that roommate to make available for the household. You might be a little bit greedy, like I might be, and hold some of it back. And so a lot of analysts will say that family income tends to be the better measure of standard of living to assess cost burden for households. So I wanted to put that out there because what we're going to do is focus on that measure, recognizing that family income is what determines eligibility for HUD programming. We tend to think that that's a slightly better measure for assessing cost burden. And so to do that, however, the standard outputs from the US Census Bureau's American Community Survey for geographies like census tracts or block groups or municipalities, they don't allow for that option of really looking at cost burden as a function of family income. So in order to do that, we have to dive into what's called the public use microdata from the American Community Survey, which provides every respondent to the ACS questionnaire as an individual record. But in order to protect privacy, we can't attach that record to very fine resolution geographies. Instead, we can attach them to what are called public use microdata areas, or PUMAs, that look something like this for our 2-county study region. There are 7 PUMAs in Erie County and 2 in Niagara County. In Erie County, they really do line up with the geography that Jason just described of having sort of the core city, the first ring suburban communities, and then the semi-rural and rural communities outside. In Niagara County, the city of Niagara Falls gets lumped in with surrounding communities of Niagara, Wheatfield, and North Tonawanda. And then there's a more rural and semi-rural in the northern part of the county. And so these are the geographies that I'll be looking at through this analysis of cost burden as it relates to family income here. But more so than that, what using this data opens up for us is an opportunity to actually look unit by unit. So at housing units based on the household type or the housing type, whether it's single family or 2-family or what have you, and the number of bedrooms there. So we can really start to hone down and drill down on what types of units are unaffordable, what types of units are we missing for our population. And so that's where we're headed. But in order to give you the sort of breakdown of where we stand in terms of housing cost burden as it relates to family income, regionally, just under 1/3 of households are considered cost burden by that standard measure of spending more than 30% of their gross monthly family income on housing. The way that breaks down by these public use microdata areas is probably what you might expect, with the severest problems occurring in the 2 PUMAs that relate to the city of Buffalo. 1205 here is the portion of Buffalo that's east of Main Street, and 1206 is the portion of Buffalo west of Main Street. So that's where we see the largest problems. And then in Niagara County, it's the PUMA with the city of Niagara Falls that has slightly above average for the region levels of cost burden, whereas in the suburban and surrounding and communities, we see below average levels of housing cost burden. Now in the final report, like Julie and Jason said, this is an interim report. And so we're just sort of getting into the breakdowns that we plan on diving a little bit deeper into. But one breakdown that we have a major interest in is persons with disabilities or households that contain persons with disabilities, because we are an older region. We're an older region with an older housing stock. And so not many of our units were actually built to accommodate individuals with special needs. And so just as a quick tangent and breakdown, I looked at housing cost burden here for households where the head of household has a disability. And in this case, the cost burden picture is much more severe, with more than 40% of such households experiencing housing cost burden. And in the city of Buffalo, it's more than half, and regardless of what geography you're looking at, east or west of Main Street. And now when you couple that unaffordability with the point that I was just trying to make, that we have a lot of older units, if we compare households where the head of householder has a disability to the rest of the population, basically, it turns out that householders with disabilities are much more likely than the rest of the population to live in older units built prior to 1950. So 40.9, basically 41% of householders with disabilities live in older units compared to 37% of the rest of the population. And again, older units weren't generally built to accommodate persons with special housing needs. And so this is, again, an avenue that we intend to explore a bit further as we go deeper into this report.
Rusty, we have a question in the chat asking by what is meant, what the definition of disability is for purposes of this data. And adding on to that, is that one large aggregated classification, or can you disaggregate it by kinds of disabilities?
Great question. Yes, we can, and yes, we plan to. So for this presentation and for the interim memo, we did sort of, the way that the Census Bureau, the way that this data set tracks it, is it looks at specific difficulties, whether that's with mobility, self-care, cognitive difficulties, or hearing or vision impairments. We can look at each of those factors individually, but then the ultimate ACS will group together just individuals who have one or more of those difficulties, and that's the group that we're looking at here. But yes, we can disaggregate that, and yes, we will plan on doing that with a special emphasis on difficulties associated with limited mobility and self-care, given the different needs that housing units would have to be able to accommodate that. So yeah, that's a great question, and we will explore that a bit further going forward in this project. And then on that note, so with that, you might imagine we don't have the fine resolution answers to these questions on this particular subpopulation yet. And so we'll zoom back out for the moment. And this is where I'm going to ask you to, again, do some imagining with me. Because what we've documented in the previous graphs are that we have this issue with unaffordability. Across the region, about 30% of households, just when you're looking at housing costs and not factoring in transportation, experience unaffordability or cost burden. And so one of the questions that LISC has asked us to explore is the one that's up here before you. What are the gaps in the current housing market? Gaps occur in a lot of dimensions. They occur geographically. They also occur in the types of units that we might be talking about. And so here I'm going to focus in on that second part. What are the gaps in terms of units that we might be facing? And so this thought exercise that I want to do is, Jason said it best, we have a lot of units. We have a lot of unused units in the region. Some of them are still vacant. We have units that are occupied by people that are struggling to pay for those units and are having affordability issues. So what if we imagine shuffling folks around or households around? What would the composition of our housing market or our housing landscape look like if we tried to achieve 100% affordability for all of these households that we've documented, this 142,000+ set of households that are currently experiencing housing unaffordability? And so we did this. We actually broke it down for those of you who have looked at the memo that we sent to LISC, the PDF. We broke this down by those public use microdata areas, and we did it tabularly. And so it's unwieldy data, and that's why it takes a bit of a stretch of the imagination, but I'll try to present it here visually and walk through what we're looking at, just to give you a sense for what are we missing from the housing market. And so I'll go through 3 graphs here where it's aggregated across the entire region rather than being broken up by Puma. I know I'm probably already putting a few of you folks to sleep, and so I don't really want to put you into your grave with data at this point. So I'll just focus in on the region as a whole. But what we tried to do here is this requires some assumptions and some decision making, because if we tried to think about an affordable unit for every single household is going to have a different level of affordability, and we're going to get into some very complicated data. So what we did here is create some bins based on other commercial data providers and what they tend to look at. And so we created bins of housing units based on their monthly expenses, whether they fall into the category of below $500 a month, from $500 to under $1,000, and so on and so forth up in these increments. We then looked at every household's family income, thought about that maximum, that ceiling that the federal government tends to use for thinking about housing affordability, 30% of that income. And we thought about which of these bins or which of these ranges a household would fall into. So what would be their ideal bin? Everyone in that bin might not be able to afford every price in that bin, but that would be where they're located. So we thought about what would be their affordable price point based on this sort of aggregation of the data. And then we looked at the actual prices that they're paying for housing cost burdened households. And then, like I said, with this micro data, we can really start to break down by the types of units that folks occupy, as well as the number of bedrooms that they might need to think about their housing needs, or at least their current housing situation, and how we might make that current housing situation more affordable. So in this chart, it's sort of broken down and centered on 0, and then values to your left of 0 are negative values. So this is where we're undersupplying units. Here we have people who can afford, in this case, it's almost always under $500 a month, this blue category. We have households for whom the affordable price would be in this bin, but they're paying in one of these bins over here. They're paying above that. So again, we're focusing mostly on lower income households here, just as a way to perform this thought exercise so we can all think together about maybe the insufficiencies in our supply and demand right now. And so what this is, for every unit type, for 0 and 1 bedroom units, we're trying to quantify the number of people who are in, say, a 2-family unit who ideally would be paying somewhat less than $500 per month for housing, but in reality, they're paying either $500 to $99 or so on up the line. And so that's what this breakdown is all about. And so just as a quick and dirty example here, for 50 plus units, since we're talking mostly about studios and one bedrooms, the bulk of the mass of our households are down here in larger multifamily units. And so if we look at larger buildings with 50 or more units, and we look at this blue bar to the left, we can see that there are about, let's say 2,300 households for whom the affordable price point would be less than $500 a month. But those 23 or so hundred households are actually paying in this distribution. Most of them, about half of them, are paying $500 to less than $1,000. A smaller chunk are paying $1,000 up to almost $1,500. And we even have some in that range that are paying $3,000 or more. Now, so those are going to be rarer circumstances. And probably that has something to do with our focus again on family income rather than household income. These may be households, non-family households of unrelated individuals who are pooling all of their money for housing. So that's a rarer occurrence. But the bigger situation is that we have units, people are occupying units, but those units are going at higher prices than what would be affordable given the income structure of the region. We could do the same thing for 2 bedrooms and see that the bulk of our need are, again, lower cost units under $500 a month, 2 family units in particular. And we can do the same thing for 3 bedroom units, which are mostly in the single and 2 family units. And again, the biggest need becomes at the bottom of the spectrum, where we have folks who are in housing who are paying more than they can afford. What they can afford is often less than $500 a month, but they get trapped up here at these higher price points. So again, if you did look at the memo, you saw all these tables that broke this information out by public use microdata area. This is kind of what we're trying to do, is just think about we have units that ideally would be paying in their affordable price range, so they're not cost burdened, but instead they're paying higher prices. And so this leads us to the question, well, what do we do about that, right? So that's the problem, is that we have housing cost burden and we want households to be able to afford where they live and still have disposable income and be able to attend to their other desires and their other needs. And so there are at least 3 big picture strategies for dealing with that, right? We can build more affordable units that are controlled in some way and make sure that the folks who need those units are getting into them. We can subsidize more existing units through things like trying to get more Section 8 properties or housing choice voucher properties, or we can pay higher wages, right? Those are all bigger picture things that are going to start to fill these mismatches between what we're paying for housing and what we can afford. One of the biggest questions or one of the biggest proposals that usually gets out there is, can't we just build our way out of this? Can't we just continue to build more affordable units and eventually that's going to correct the problem? Well, maybe, but if we leave building just to the markets as it's predominantly been left to in the region, what we're building isn't exactly matching with what we need. So these are all units built, I thought I had this notation on here, but it must have disappeared somewhere in my notes. So this is a summary of all units that were built after 2010. So these are units that were built in the last decade. And if we break this down by public use microdata area, there are 2 dots for each. One shows the average price, one shows the median for you stats nerds. When those 2 numbers are almost identical, you have what's close to a bell curve or a normal distribution. When they're far apart, that means that you have outliers. You have some higher end units that are pulling that average up, where the median is sort of the middle price point. And when you look at the average and median prices for the units that have been built in the last decade, they don't come anywhere close to this threshold where we've identified a lot of need, right? If we put this floor down here of $500 per month, which is our lowest bin, our most affordable bin, where we have the greatest need, the closest that we come to that is over on the west side of Buffalo. The median monthly cost of units being built is just over $800, with again higher end units pulling that average up. But in a lot of our suburbs and surrounding communities, we're building units that are costing more. Now, of course, that has a lot to do with financing, access to credit in terms of ownership opportunities, in terms of rent. It's about the contract rent that's being asked for units. But the truth of the matter is the units that we're building aren't building us out of an affordability issue. They're building us closer and closer into it. And in fact, they're just building, on top of the problems that we have until, eventually it's going to fall over until we start thinking about making these better connections and better matches between the income profile of our region and the units that we're building. So just like Jason, I'll end on a couple of big picture takeaways from the data so far. One is, just that tangent that we have to explore in a lot more depth is that there appears to be an undersupply of affordable and accessible units for persons with disabilities. The big one is, as far as we see it right now, is that we tend to have an undersupply of units below $500 per month at all bedroom levels of all unit types. The largest undersupply when you quantify all of that is in 1 and 2 family units. And the new construction that we've been doing over the past decade isn't, addressing these gaps. Instead, we're building for higher prices. And so there is, a geographical theory, right? It's called housing filtering. That's if higher income individuals leave their units and go to the higher end units that are being built, that's going to drive down the price, put downward pressure on the price of the units that they were previously occupying, making those more affordable. But based on the numbers that we're seeing and the trends in housing cost burden over time, that's not what's playing out here. And so we have this continual perpetual affordability issue. And largely that's because we do have units. Again, we have families in units. The issue is while housing might exist, the income doesn't. And that's the big problem, is that we're not building housing that's reflective of the actual income distribution of our region. And we're not really making sure that our new units are going to become affordable for the folks that we have here in our community. And so those are really the big takeaways that we have. For a moment here, I'll put up our last slide that has both Jason's and my email address on it. Again, I mentioned another study that we did specific for Erie County that's goes into a lot more depth here. So for those of you who might be interested in that, feel free to contact us. If you have questions that you can't think of right now, but you want to reach out to us on these issues, again, feel free to connect with us and we'll try to help you out on that. And most importantly, if you have feedback on questions that we should be asking and answering as we go forward, please do let us know. And that's all that we've got for you here. I think we stuck to just under 4 o'clock.
So I just, before we start on questions, I do want to just take a moment to recognize the Partnership for the Public Good has been, was our kind of project sponsor and kind of the connection between LISC and our research. And so I do want to just mention, the great folks there who've been doing research on housing in a number of different fronts, have produced a number of briefs around issues of race and poverty in the region, and have been amazing partners. So I just want to thank all of our friends over at PPG. And then I wanted to invite you just quickly before we go to questions, Rusty, if you can just outline for everyone kind of the next steps in terms of what additional data you were waiting for. I know it's covered in the front of the brief, but and the time frame for wrapping this up.
Yeah, I should have had a slide on that. So what we have done is we've made data requests from all the municipalities basically in the 2 counties, and we're working on getting data on permits for units that have been built. We're also working on getting any data that's kept by municipalities on property code violations, so we can start to get into the weeds of what are the quality of these units that we have. And then all of the data that I just presented on this public use micro data samples from the Census Bureau, that is all for the American Community Survey that covers the period 2014 to 2018. The newer data that came out for 2019 came out in December for standard releases from the Census Bureau, but for the public use micro data, it just came out 7 days ago. And so I haven't been able to replicate all of these graphs and these analyses for that new data yet. And so that will be part of our project. That's another reason actually why we didn't build out in further detail some of the challenges with different degrees of or levels of affordability issues. We're looking at different types of difficulties or disabilities because we're going to have to repeat all of this for the new data set anyway. And so that's where we're going with that. And then once we have a good sense of that current picture from right now, which is really what we've talked about today, is what's going on now and what have been the changes in the recent past, that's when we're going to start our projections of looking ahead and thinking about the population to come, where it's likely to come based on development patterns and patterns of population growth. And then thinking, again, just about how we can start to better match and align the assets that we have that are usable units, to the population that we have and that we expect to have going forward. So those are a lot of our next steps. Jason, if I missed anything, feel free to chime in.
I think the only data point that we didn't touch on here at all in the interim report and Rusty didn't mention would be somewhat of a simple analysis of real estate transaction data, which we've done at the municipal level. We'll try to add some of that flavor into this as well.
And one of the things that LISC is going to be reaching out to Rusty and Jason on is to the extent to which this data can have a racial background breakdown. We want to really make sure that we're considering those equity issues, because we know a lot of the patterns are shaped by other forces as well beyond pure economics. So with that, I want to invite people. We've had a couple of comments in the chat. I would just, for Dale, I wonder if you want to share, and or Lenny, just your observations based upon kind of your perspective and thinking in this space, and if we have other questions.
This is Lenny Skrill. I saw someone from Rochester here. In Rochester, there's only one Section 8 administrator, which is the Rochester Housing Authority. And any development of affordable housing in Monroe County is eligible for project-based rent subsidies that would allow a project owner, be it not-for-profit or for-profit, to rent it for people with very low incomes, but at a rental income that can effectively operate. Having $500 a month rent is a path to project failure. It's not enough income to operate. And so if you're expecting affordable housing without rent subsidies to serve those people who can only afford $500 a month, I think it's not realistic, because there's not enough rental income to operate effectively.
Thanks, Lenny.
Well,
Dale?
Lenny's still speaking. You're muted,
Oh, sorry,
Lenny.
about that.
Lenny, you're on mute.
Every other community in upstate New York, the Section 8 administrators work with the affordable housing providers to provide rent subsidies so you reach that 30% of income band. It's only in Buffalo where you have 3 different Section 8 administrators who don't work together necessarily well and don't embrace project-based rent subsidies that doesn't occur, and it creates a problem.
Thank you, Lenny.
Just a couple of points. I've said for a while that there's 2 ways to create affordable housing. You either subsidize the developer or you subsidize the tenant. Russell mentioned the 3rd way is that increase incomes. But by the time you increase incomes for everybody, some people are on SSI or SSD, the income's not going up anytime soon. So there's a gap there. I think there's a need for public housing and rental subsidies. I agree with Lenny, and I disagree with him a little bit, because with a Section 8 voucher, you give a tenant the flexibility to move where they want, and you can give them some mobility. If you just limit it to where a developer is building, they're kind of limited to where that structure is. So I think you need a combination of both. You need that flexibility to have some people move where they want, and then you also have to subsidize the developer too. So I'm genuinely thrilled at the study, because it will give you that gap that we need, and it'll drive hopefully the development later on, and trying to figure out how to do this. And I'll send you more comments privately. But I definitely think you're on the right track, and I'm excited. That's hard to do.
Thanks, Dale. That's a great stamp of endorsement at this late hour. I really want to encourage people to feel free to ask us questions either in the chat or to take off your mute button. So often the data gets done, it gets scrubbed a lot. LISC hasn't played with this report at all. We've not edited anything that you're hearing out of Jason and Rusty. And, we want to, allow a high degree of transparency here. We don't have an agenda on this. We're really trying to let the data drive up where we need to do our work and support our partners. So I see a note from Rawa saying we need more supportive housing in the region, especially in Buffalo. We also need to talk about quality housing and sustainability mandates. Thank you, Rawa. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, I was, agreeing both with what Lenny was saying, also the need for other types of more affordable and subsidized housing, but supportive housing specifically didn't come up. So I really just want to lift that up. And for me, I think the quality of the housing always has to be part of the conversation in Buffalo because of our housing stock, and the fact that most of these homes, especially for folks, is they're unlivable conditions. And then there is also the real reality and what it's going to mean for this region that we have a pretty advanced climate legislation that is economy-wide that will be shifting, energy efficiency and new heat pump technology and, other kinds of systems as we get out of gas into an electrified and more sustainable clean energy world. So that is all in play. And as we talk about both the affordability, we also have to have these conversations around, the shifts and changes that we'll be making in the region.
Thank you, Rawa. Matt Lieber is with LISC's National Housing Team, and he put a chat around a comment in the chat around the Biden housing plan. Matt, do you want to share that?
Sure. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Cool. Hey, so I was just, surmising, and I think we all know this is in no way, certain to happen. But if the Biden housing plan, which surprisingly included the full funding of Section 8, which I think was a beautiful surprise to everybody on this phone call, if that is in fact realized, and I'm thinking about some of the roadblocks we've run into in places like Pittsburgh, where the housing authority, when they are trying to checkerboard tenants, they're doing a demo dispo or doing some sort of new development, can't even find places to put tenants to checkerboard them because places aren't meeting HQS. I think if we kind of extrapolate upon that, we start thinking if the number of people with portable vouchers is also expanded and there's newfound focus on requiring private landlords to take vouchers, then we really have to, on the policy side, and have some dollars behind that to make sure that landlords, and in Buffalo, a place that has some of, if not the oldest housing stock in the nation, have the ability to rehab to HQS to get those tenants in. I'll put myself back on mute. Nice to talk.
Thanks, Matt. Great. Any other?
I do have my Buffalo Bills and Benny the Butcher collab sweatshirt on. For professional reasons, I'm just going to say that out loud and not show you.
There's a little, LISC has a Kansas City office, so there's a little smack talk happening at the LISC national level this week. So
I can't wait till Monday.
All right, it's 4:11 on a Friday, and I want to thank each and every one of you. If you have, Blythe, you have a question here. Can we look at the opportunity to renovate existing housing stock through employment programs, revitalize houses, improve neighborhoods, and build skills? I think that is definitely part of the conversation, and I think what we're trying to do is if we're looking at the renovation priorities, how does that fit with the audiences and the population so that we're really thinking about it from a user-focused approach versus, being solely focused on kind of building code and the building as it was historically laid out. You know, we might prioritize certain adaptations, for example, that may not have been higher priorities if in fact we're trying to serve a particular audience. There are, oh great, I'm so glad, I almost let you go, and now there are lots of things in the chat. Elizabeth Murphy is saying development costs and operating cost data are important to build into our analysis. Similar to Lenny's point, if we want to focus on supply as a key strategy, then there has to be an analysis of what the cost of providing those units is and figuring out how to provide enough subsidy to cover the gaps. New construction may have different costs than rehab, and formal affordable housing programs like LIHTC units may have different costs than rehab of existing units for smaller scale private market landlords. And thank you so much from Elizabeth. I think simultaneously, I will recognize that a number of the foundations helped fund a LISC collaborative effort with several of the partners on this call to look at driving down the cost of building new housing units through some innovative design pieces. That proposal is running in parallel. And one of the reasons why we pushed Rusty and Jason to get us some of this data, because we want to really design that model based around need. Brendan Mahaffey was just saying, looking forward to more detailed analysis of the housing stock and disability. The age of housing unit associated with disability highlights an area of concern that should be understood more. I will certainly say in the area of disability, this is, we tend to also aggregate the data. And so I'm particularly, and there's a lot of still pejorative language around individuals with disability and the kinds of universal access spaces that, you know, we need and or desire in terms of really creating an inclusive community that really opens up opportunities for everyone in our community. Disability is an incredibly pervasive, you know, component of our population. I think at least 10% of the population is estimated to be having either a visible and or acknowledged and or invisible disability. And Angelina White at Benlick was saying, look, I think looking at housing quality and how it relates to, sorry, I've got to scroll. Public health, asthma-led geography is important as well. And I think the area for which if, you know, both Jason and Rusty were, you know, are very much open to grabbing that data. It's hard to get quality data in this space. And I know that we've been doing some other projects. Getting the information out of our municipalities and really honing in on this is an opportunity for us to refine the data and continue to work in that area. We will not have all perfect data as we do this, but we're hoping that we can continue to iterate and maybe identify some opportunities to improve data collection. And I think I want to just open it up in case anyone has any additional questions. Brittany, do you want to share your comment?
Sure. I was just mentioning that when we talk about accessible units or accessibility of our old housing stock, really encouraging us to use universal design as the goal or standard or aims that we're headed toward, only because Fair Housing Act, the guidelines there, the ADA standards are often a bare minimum that are certainly inadequate to meet diverse needs of people throughout the lifetime. So just being careful that we're not striving for the bare minimum when we set the goals, you know, after looking at the data and kind of assessing where we are, when stating goals of where we want to be, setting our standards a little higher than that.
Thank you. Anyone else? Last time I got ready to, you know, close out the meeting, we got this flurry of comments, so keep them coming. And I do want to just say, I think, you know, and there's the income piece, there's the supply piece, there's a whole geographic dimension of this, which is, you know, to the extent many of us have been in workforce development conversations that are talking about trying to solve a housing, employment, or school mismatch problem by creating better busing. We love our friends at the NFTA, and we think it's not fair to place the entire burden on either them to create a system that's really not that's set up to create, you know, address really difficult challenges, or to really assume that individuals who are trying to move their families through pathways to stability don't have the ability to really capture that lost time in transportation. We like to say that we're a 20-minute city, but that is all about car privilege. If you don't have a car, the city is not a 20-minute community. And so we want to be thinking about those spatial mismatch issues as well. All right, it's 4:17. I really want to thank Jason and Rusty and the amazing folks, Andrea and others at PPG, for being part of this incredible project and for helping us stretch our thinking around affordable housing and around finding a pathway to solving this issue. It's going to cost a lot of money and it's going to take a lot of time. It will require both approaches that help to increase income and close the mismatch between the built structures. But if we don't know how many units we need, where, and how much they're going to cost, then we're really not going to make the significant level of progress we need to really address these issues. So I want to thank everyone who's being such amazing listeners today. I really want to invite you to dig into the reports. If you don't understand the data, please ask us to sit down and go through it with you. We want to democratize this information. I've had to learn some crazy technical stuff in my career. I've learned about contaminated sediments, energy microgrids, relicensing of hydropower projects, the licensing of the national grid system. I didn't know any of that stuff to start. And this is all learnable. It is not supposed to be the purview of researchers alone. We really have to share this information with a larger community so that we can make collective decisions. So thank you everyone for being part of this conversation. Please ask us questions. We look forward to taking this to the next level. We will be in touch with another meeting date to take this to the next step. Thank you so much.
I've saved the chat, so you're good to close when you're ready, Julie.
Thank you. Brittany, can we also get the final list of participants before we close?
I don't know now that there are just a few still on the line. I don't know if it's possible to go back to see who all was in the meeting. That
Okay.
might be part of the recording.
Okay.
We'll double check.
I'll stop the recording too. Thank you, Brittany.
No problem.